At first light, the Outback looks clean. A flat, pale world rinsed by cold air. No shadows long enough to hide anything. No darkness left to blame. And that's why what they saw in the gully didn't look real. The herd wasn't scattered. It wasn't stampeded into miles of spinifex. It wasn't torn apart the way dogs or dingoes leave a kill. It was still there, clustered tight, shoulder to shoulder like they'd been driven into a corner. Except there were no hoofprints leading away. No drag marks. No struggle you could read in the dirt. Because the cattle were wrapped where they stood. Not in the fragile, lace-thin cobweb you brush aside without thinking. This was rope-thick silk, pulled tight enough to bow the nearest fence post, thick enough to dull the sun into a chalky haze wherever it crossed your line of sight. And it made a sound. A low hum, almost musical, whenever the wind touched it, like a wire under tension. If you're listening on headphones, understand what that means. It wasn't just something you saw. It was something the air itself played. The senior drover, Reeve, stood at the rim of the gully with his rifle half-raised, unable to decide whether aiming would help or just make him feel less helpless. Behind him, someone whispered, "Don't touch it." And then, from the direction of the station yard, came the second sound. A small, steady clicking. Not from a boot, not from a loose buckle. Mechanical, patient. The telegraph sounder. Click, click, click. Reeve turned his head slowly, like a man afraid the movement itself might set something off. The telegraph room was shut. The line had been dead for years. And yet the sounder kept tapping, quietly, as if someone was practicing a language in a place no one was meant to hear it. Now listen carefully. If you click away now, you keep the comforting version of the Outback. Empty country, hard men, clean disappearances blamed on heat and bad luck. But if you follow what those drovers followed, you'll start to understand the real shape of it. Because the silk in that gully wasn't a nest. It was infrastructure. And once you realize that, you don't feel like you're watching a creature story. You feel like you've stepped into something built. Something that doesn't need to chase you. It only needs you to keep walking. 3 days earlier, the country still felt ordinary. Ordinary in the way the interior is ordinary. Brutal, wide, and indifferent, like a god that never learned your name. Reeves' mob was moving cattle east across a dry run of station land, aiming for a known water point before the heat set in. 6 men, 2 dogs, and a string of pack horses that carried flour, tea, cartridges, and canvas. They were not green boys. They knew what the Outback does to men who get romantic about it. They'd seen lost stock, dead horses, bleached bones that looked like old fence posts from a distance. What they had not seen, what none of them were prepared to understand, was the idea that something out here might be working the land the way a man works a property. Not surviving. Operating. The first sign came in the morning, before the sun had teeth. A strand across a mulga gap at knee height. So thin it seemed like a trick of light. One of the younger hands, Klein, walked into it and jerked back as if he'd touched a hot wire. His face tightened. "Bloody hell," he said, shaking his fingers. Reeves stepped over and pinched the strand between thumb and forefinger. It didn't crumble, it didn't drift. It held. It pulled back against him with a quiet elastic strength, like gut line. "What is it?" Klein asked. Reeve didn't answer right away. He looked around for the obvious. Spider web in the branches, a nest, a fat-bodied thing waiting. There was nothing. Just scrub and dust, and the flat breath of wind across stone. Reeve took his knife and tested it. The blade met resistance, real resistance, and the strand parted slowly, reluctantly, as if it resented being cut. When it finally gave, it didn't drop to the ground. It snapped away into the scrub, vanishing as if it had never been there. The dogs didn't bark. That should have been the second sign. Dogs bark at things they don't understand. They bark at smells and shadows. These dogs only sniffed once, ears pinned, and then moved on like they'd been corrected. Klein watched the strand retract and swallowed. "You seen that before?" Reeves slid the knife away. "No." He said it flat, not fear exactly, just a fact. Then he added, quieter, as if the country itself might be listening. "Keep your eyes down." They pushed on. By midday the heat was up, pressing from above like a hand. The cattle moved slow, heads down, tongues dark. Flies gathered around eyes and nostrils. Reeve rationed water, not because he was cruel, but because he'd learned the math. You never know how long the country will demand payment. The next sign came when they found a kangaroo. Not torn, not eaten. Just fixed in place. It hung from a low branch near a shallow depression, wrapped around the torso and legs in pale bands that tightened the body into a stiff shape. No blood. No mess. It looked preserved, like meat kept in a dry shed. Klein stared at it too long. "Is that a prank?" No one laughed. Reeves circled it, careful not to brush the bands. He looked for tracks beneath it. He found only hard ground and faint scuffs that could have been anything. Then he saw the silk line. A single strand running from the wrapped animal into the scrub, disappearing low to the ground. Like a tether. Like a signal line. Reeve felt something cold move in his stomach that had nothing to do with water. He didn't say spider. He didn't give the thing a name. Naming makes you think you understand. Understanding makes you careless. Instead he said, "We're not stopping here." And he made it an order. As they moved off, Klein kept looking back over his shoulder. If you were there, if you were the one walking behind the herd with a rifle and dust in your teeth, you'd feel it too. That sensation that you've walked past a warning sign you can't read. And the worst part is knowing the Outback doesn't put up signs for nothing. That night they camped on rock, not sand. Reeve chose a rise of limestone that offered wind and visibility. He kept the cattle tight and the horses closer. No fire, just a small lantern hooded under canvas, because flame draws eyes. And in the dark, the country had its usual sounds. Distant insects, a low wind in scrub, the occasional cough of cattle. But layered under it all was something else. A faint, intermittent clicking. Not loud enough to point toward. Not steady enough to swear by. Just a delicate tick-tick that came and went like a thought you can't shake. Klein heard it too. Reeve could tell by the way he kept turning his head, listening with his whole body. "What is that?" Klein whispered. Reeve didn't answer. He watched the cattle. Cattle sleep in a shallow way. They wake easy, move as a group, spook as one. If the mob panicked, Reeve wanted to see it start. But the cattle were still. Not relaxed, just subdued. As if the entire herd was holding its breath. Near midnight, one of the dogs stood and stared into the scrub without barking. "Ray." Eve's hand tightened on his rifle. He tried to see what the dog saw. Nothing moved. No Aishin. No silhouette against starlight. Just scrub and black space. Then the dog sat down again, as if whatever was there had told it to. Reeve didn't sleep after that. He watched the edge of the world until the sky began to pale. And when morning came, he told them they were changing course toward the old telegraph station. Not because it was closer. Because it was structure, a place you could take a position. In the Outback, you learn to love walls. They reached the telegraph station late the second day. It was a squat building of weathered timber and stone, half swallowed by dust. The pole line that once ran beside it was long gone, posts snapped, wires stripped or sagging into the scrub. The building looked abandoned in the normal way buildings do out here, like a man had walked away, and the sun had been eating it ever since. But the closer they got, the more the wrong details added up. The yard fence had pale strands draped across it like leftover washing line. The station door had something stretched between the knob and the frame, thin, nearly invisible, but arranged too neatly to be accident. Even the ground itself looked different, as if a fine powder had been sprinkled in patches. Klein stopped at the gate. Reeve. Reeve didn't ask what. He could see it too. He approached slowly and crouched. A strand ran from the fence post down into the dirt. Not lying on top. Inserted. As if it had been pushed into the earth. Reeve dug with the tip of his knife. The soil gave way, and the blade struck something hard. He scraped until a dark shape appeared. A hook. Not iron. Not stone. A glossy black curved shard shaped like a claw, buried like an anchor. The silk line wrapped around it tensioned. The structure was deliberate. Someone or something had pegged the web into the country. Klein's voice went thin. That's not natural. Reeve stood, wiping his knife on his trousers. No, he said, it's not. He stared at the building like it might open its mouth. Then he said the thing that should have been obvious from the start, and somehow still landed like a blow. This place isn't abandoned. They pushed into the yard anyway, because where else do you go when the land itself feels strung? The horses didn't like it. They snorted and pulled back, rolling their eyes. One tried to rear and had to be calmed with a hard hand. Reeve tied them near the far fence, away from the building. He didn't want them close. Not after what he'd seen in the gully. Inside, the telegraph room smelled of old dust and dry wood. There was a bench along one wall, an instrument set, key, sounder, coils, ghost machinery from a time when men tried to civilize distance. Klein walked up to it as if drawn. Line S dead, he said, more to reassure himself than anyone. Reeve nodded. He already knew. Everyone did. And then, as if the building heard them say it, the sounder clicked once. Just once. A sharp metallic tap. All heads turned. Klein froze with his hand half raised. Reeve stared at the instrument. The sounder clicked again. Then again. Slow, patient. As if some unseen operator was trying to remember the rhythm of words. Reeve felt the back of his neck go tight. He didn't want to touch the instrument. Touching it would make it real in a way listening didn't. But he leaned in, close enough to see what his eyes didn't want to admit. A strand of silk, so fine it looked like hair, ran from the window frame down to the bench. And it was resting against the sounder's metal arm. Every time the strand shifted, whether from wind, from vibration, from something outside pulling the line, the metal tapped. Click. Click. Klein whispered, "It's using it." Reeve didn't answer. Because in that moment, the Outback stopped being a place where men disappeared by accident. It became a place where something had learned how men communicate. And if it could learn that, what else could it learn? Reeve backed away from the bench. He spoke to the men without taking his eyes off the window. Lock the door. One of them moved to obey. Reeve added quietly. The latch clicked. The sounder answered. Click, click. Then outside, somewhere beyond the wall, a heavy scrape traveled across dirt. Slow. Deliberate. Not the rush of a startled animal. The movement of something that already knows where you are. Klein swallowed hard. Reeve turned his head slightly, not toward the men, toward you almost, toward the idea of anyone listening later. And he said, "We're not the first to stand in this room." He glanced at the corners, at the rafters, at the shadows that didn't feel empty anymore. And we won't be the last, unless we leave proof. The sounder clicked again, softer this time, like a response. And out in the yard, one of the horses screamed. The horse didn't scream like an animal in pain. It screamed like something that had just understood it was about to be taken. A single tearing sound, high and thin, followed by the crash of hooves against timber. Inside the telegraph room, every man froze. The sounder clicked once, then stopped as if it was listening too. Reeve moved first. He crossed the room in 3 steps, grabbed the lantern and swung the door open. Heat and dust rushed in. The yard was a pale bowl of sand and scrub shadow, all of it threaded with faint lines that only showed when the light hit at the right angle. The horses were at the far fence, straining at their ties. One had its eyes rolled white, neck bowed, pulling so hard the rope bit into its hide. Reeve lifted the lantern higher. And that's when the men saw what the horse had seen. The silk wasn't just draped on the fence. It was moving. Not fluttering. Drawing. A thick strand, nearly as thick as a man's thumb, ran from the fence post into the scrub. It tightened by degrees, like a winch cable taking up slack. The fence post creaked. The horse screamed again and threw its weight backward. For a heartbeat, it looked like the horse might win. Then the strand snapped tighter and the horse lurched forward, not by its own choice. Hooves carved trenches in the sand as it was dragged sideways into the fence line. The other horses panicked and pulled, tangling. Reeve raised his rifle. Klein grabbed his sleeve. "Don't shoot." Reeve didn't look at him. "Get the axe." The younger hand sprinted toward the linta where tools were stored. Reeve kept his rifle trained on the strand, tracking it into the scrub like it was a snake. But there was nothing to shoot. No body, no target. Just a line under tension and a horse being pulled, inch by inch, toward where the line vanished. If you were there, headphones on, you'd hear the worst part, the horse's breath. Not the scream. The breath short, panic snorts, the wet rasp of an animal trying to inhale against fear. Reeve moved to the horse, careful to avoid the thinner strands strung between posts at shin height. He reached for the rope tie. A fine line of silk touched his wrist. It stuck instantly with a grip that felt wrong, like touching fresh pitch. Reeve jerked back and the silk stretched with him, then pulled back against his movement as if correcting him. He stared at it. Then he felt it through the strand, through his skin, a faint vibration traveling away from him into the scrub. As if the land itself had just been notified. Reeve's throat tightened. "Cut it," he snapped. Klein arrived with the axe and swung at the thick strand where it crossed the fence rail. The blade bit, but not clean. It took 2 hard strikes to sever it, and when it finally snapped, it recoiled into the scrub so fast it looked alive. The horse sagged, suddenly free, and collapsed to its knees. Breathing, alive. But the victory felt wrong. Too small. Because the line hadn't been tied like a rope. It had been set, anchored, tensioned, part of a larger thing you couldn't see. Reeve backed away from the fence, lantern lifted, scanning the scrub beyond. "Inside," he said. One of the men, older with a dry cough, hesitated. "We can't stay in there." Reeve's voice went flat. "We can't stay out here." They dragged the horse up by the halter, half carrying it back toward the building, stepping around strands they were only now beginning to notice. Thin lines at ankle height. Waist height. Some so fine they only appeared when the lantern passed over them, glittering for a split second like fishing line. It wasn't a web. It was a grid. They shoved the horses into the yard corner nearest the building and slammed the stable gate. Then they bolted themselves inside the telegraph station again, breathing hard, listening for the next sound that would tell them where the monster was. The sounder clicked once. Soft. Like a fingernail. Reeve stared at the instrument, and felt a cold certainty settle in. It wasn't outside the yard yet. It was already part of the building. They blocked the windows first. Not with boards, there were no boards. With whatever they could find, canvas, sacks, a broken table top. Not to keep it out. To keep themselves from seeing the lines. Because once you start seeing lines everywhere, your brain can't stop. Every shadow becomes a strand. Every breath feels like it might vibrate something. Reeve forced them to work. Work kept the panic from becoming a religion. They moved supplies into one room. Water, biscuits, ammunition, the powder sack they'd carried for clearing stumps. They checked doors. They checked gaps under the walls. They checked the roof for holes. And all the while, the sounder kept tapping at irregular intervals, never enough to become normal, never enough to ignore. Click. Pause. Click, click. Long pause. Then a single tap like punctuation. Klein stood near the bee. Inch, eyes fixed on the silk thread touching the sounder arm. It's the wind, he tried. Reeve didn't answer. Because the wind had died outside, the yard had gone still, the leaves weren't moving, the air felt held. And still the sounder clicked. If it wasn't wind, then it was a pull from somewhere else, somewhere connected to the same line that had dragged the horse. Meaning the telegraph instrument wasn't making a random noise. It was functioning as intended. A signal device. Only now the operator wasn't a man. Reeve leaned close, watching the sounder arm rise and fall by fractions. He imagined, unwillingly, a leg tip brushing the line outside testing. Or worse, something in the scrub pulling and releasing tension like a hand on a key. Klein whispered, "It's like it knows what it is." Reeve's reply came out low. "Or it's learning." That was the first time anyone said it plainly. Not just that the thing was big. Not just that it was deadly. That it was capable of adjusting to them. And the moment you accept that, the Outback stops being a place you can outlast. It becomes a place you can be studied. Night came hard, as it does out here. 1 minute the yard was gray. The next it was black, and the lantern became the only thing that existed. The men ate without appetite. Biscuits turned to paste in their mouths. Water tasted like canvas and fear. Reeve assigned positions like a soldier. One man at the rear door. One watching the front. Klein with the rifle because his hands shook less than the others. Reeve kept the lantern low and listened. And that's when the second sound started. Not the telegraph. Not horses. A faint scrape along the outside wall. Slow, deliberate. Like something dragging the tip of a stick across timber. The older man with the cough made a noise in his throat. "It's walking around us." Reeve nodded once, eyes on the door frame, on the thin gaps where moonlight cut in. The scrape moved. Stopped. Started again on the other side of the building. The thing outside wasn't trying to break in. It was measuring. Mapping. Finding where the structure gave. The sounder clicked. Reeve felt the urge to smash it with the butt of his rifle, primitive, irrational. As if destroying the instrument would destroy the intelligence touching it. But he didn't. Because the instrument wasn't the cause. It was the symptom. Outside, the horses stamped once, twice, then went quiet. Not settled. Quiet the way prey goes quiet when it's listening for the predator's next step. Then a new sound, a soft, wet pull. Like cloth being peeled off wood. The older man shifted his weight. "What's that?" Reeve moved to the window slit, where canvas didn't fully cover. He lifted a corner by a hair, just enough to look. The yard was a black bowl under starlight, the fence line barely visible. But the silk, some of it, caught the faint light and became visible as pale threads crossing the open space. And along the fence post nearest the stable gate, something climbed. Not a full leg yet. Just a jointed shape, thick, bristled, moving with a steadiness that didn't match any insect Reeve had seen. It hooked into the wood, then moved again higher. Reeve let the canvas fall. His heart was not pounding. That was the strange part. It felt heavy and slow, as if his body was trying to conserve oxygen for what it already knew was coming. He turned to the men. "No one fires," he said. Klein stared at him as if he'd lost his mind. "It's out there." Reeve's voice sharpened. "If you fire, you tell it exactly where we are. And if you hit it, if you actually manage to hurt it, you'll make it come through the wall instead of around it." The scrape outside stopped. The sounder clicked twice. Klein swallowed and lowered the rifle a fraction. Reeve continued, quieter now. "We wait, we listen, and when it commits to a door, we move." He didn't add what he was thinking, because thinking it felt like inviting it into the room. That the building wasn't a fortress. It was a box. And the thing outside didn't need to break the box. It only needed to make them run out of it. An hour passed in a kind of suspended misery. The scrape returned, now at the rear. Then at the front. Then at the roofline, faint, almost too subtle to register. Dust drifted down from the rafters, catching the lantern light. Klein looked up. Reeve followed his gaze. A thin strand of silk lowered from a roof gap, descending slowly like a fishing line. It moved in deliberate increments, pausing, then lowering again. It wasn't dangling at random. It was being placed. Reeve's mouth went dry. He watched the strand descend, toward the table where they'd piled supplies. Toward the water. Toward their center. The older man whispered, "It's coming in." Reeve didn't answer. He raised his knife. The strand touched the table edge and stuck. Then it tightened slightly, as if testing tension. The sounder clicked. Klein breathed, "It's connected." Reeve stepped forward and cut the strand. The blade met resistance. The silk parted slowly. The moment it severed, it snapped upward like a whip and vanished into the roof gap. And in the same instant outside, something heavy thudded against the rear wall. Not a strike meant a breakthrough. A message. A response. Reeve backed away, knife still raised. Klein's rifle came up, despite the earlier order. Reeve hissed, "Don't." Then the sound changed. A low vibration ran through the wall, through the floorboards, into their feet. Not a roar. A thrumming like a cello note played too close. It lasted 3 seconds. Then stopped. The horses screamed again, muffled by distance. And that's when Reeve understood what the vibration was. Not anger. Not pain. Communication. The web outside was carrying information back to the body you couldn't see. And now the thing knew exactly what they'd done. You cut a line. It answered. You cut another. It adjusted. The Outback wasn't just land anymore. It was an instrument. And they were the ones plucking it. Reeve decided they would leave before dawn. Not because dawn made it safe. Because dawn gave them light to see the lines. And because staying another night meant the thing had more time to rig the yard tighter, to set more strands through roof gaps, to learn the rhythm of their movements. They packed quietly. They kept their voices to whispers. They rationed ammunition like it was blood. And Reeve did something that felt strange even as he did it. He unbolted the telegraph key from the bench. Klein stared. "Why take that?" Reeve wrapped it in cloth and put it in his coat. "Because later," he said, "when someone calls us liars, I want something from this place in my hand." Klein looked away, as if he couldn't stand the idea of needing proof. Because the Outback has a special cruelty, it trains men to distrust stories. Out here, lies get you killed. Exaggeration makes you careless. So when something truly impossible happens, no one has the language for it. Only objects, only scars, only the tremor in your hands when you try to pour water. At the first gray hint of morning, they opened the front door. Not wide. A crack. Reeve held the lantern low and scanned the threshold. Silk lines crossed the doorway like tripwires. Some at shin height, some at chest height, woven so fine they seemed like dust until the light caught them. Reeve felt his jaw tighten. It had done this while they were inside. Not a random animal. A planner. He cut the lowest strands. Each cut sent a faint vibration away into the yard, like a pulse traveling down a nerve. Klein whispered, "It'll feel that." Reeve nodded, "It already has." They stepped out anyway, moving slow, lifting boots high, placing feet on hard ground and rock where possible. They kept the horses between them and the scrub, using them like unwilling shields. The horses trembled, nostrils flaring, eyes wide. Reeve chose the creek line to the north. Rock underfoot, less sand, less vibration. At least that was the idea. They moved along the dry channel, careful not to kick stones. Every sound felt amplified. Every breath felt like a confession. The farther they got from the station, the less the men spoke. Not because there was nothing to say. Because speech required air, and air felt expensive. And because part of each man believed, superstitiously, that words might carry. That the thing might be listening not just to vibration, but to intention. Half a mile out, Klein stopped. He pointed down at the creek bed. A strand lay across the stones at ankle height. It was thicker than the earlier ones, rope-like. Reeve stepped over it. The silk didn't sag. It held its line, tensioned perfectly between two scrub roots as if it had been strung like wire. Klein didn't step yet. His boot hovered. And in that pause, the strand began to tremble. A faint oscillation traveling along its length, away from them. Reeve's stomach turned. Not because the strand moved. Because it moved as if it had been waiting for their foot to hover above it. As if it had been positioned specifically for this moment. Reeve cut it. The recoil snapped into scrub. The tremble continued on a neighboring strand they hadn't noticed until then. Another line catching the signal, carrying it onward. A network. Redundancy. The older man with the cough whispered, "We're walking in it." Reeve didn't deny it. He scanned the scrub ahead and saw, in the dawn light, faint glints, multiple strands crossing a narrow passage. A corridor. A funnel. The kind drovers used to move cattle. The kind predators used to steer prey. Reeve backed them away. They climbed out of the creek bed onto limestone, choosing exposure over corridors. And up there on rock, the world opened. The interior spread out in all directions, flat scrub, red sand, pale salt pack. Distant rises like the backs of sleeping beasts. And far off, near a gully line, something moved. At first it looked like a dead tree swaying. Then it took a step. A leg rose and planted, slow, heavy, controlled. Then another. The body remained low, but the height of its back still cleared the scrub. Even at distance, the scale made Reeve's skin tighten. This was not a spider you could step on. This was something you could build a stable under. Klein dropped to a knee instinctively, rifle up. Reeve pushed the barrel down. "Not yet," he whispered. Klein's eyes were wet with anger. "It's right there." Reeve's voice stayed calm, which was worse. "It's not right there," he said. "It's right where we're going." Because the spider wasn't running to them. It wasn't charging like an animal made stupid by hunger. It was moving like a patrol. Like a thing walking a boundary. like a man checking fence lines. And that meant it didn't need to chase. It only needed to keep them inside the country it had already strung. By midday, heat shimmer rose from the sand. Distance became unreliable. The horizon wavered like water. The men rationed sips of water and kept moving, tongues thick, lips cracking. They found signs that should have comforted them: human debris, a scrap of canvas snagged on thorn, a broken bottle half buried. Instead, those signs felt like bones. Proof that someone else had been here and had not made it out clean. The canvas had a faint mark on it, an old station brand from further north. Reeves stared at it longer than necessary. It meant someone had traveled from that direction. It meant the interior wasn't empty. It was being used. Klein looked up from the canvas. "You think they—" Reeve cut him off. "We keep moving." But the canvas became a direction anyway, not because it promised safety. Because it promised information. They followed it to a shallow limestone sink where the scrub grew thicker and the air cooled. The smell arrived first. Sweet rot. Spoiled fruit and wet grain. Silk smell. Reeve slowed, lantern out even though the sun was high, because shade in the sink made shadows deeper than they should have been. At the bottom of the sink, propped against rock like someone had been set down and told to wait, was a man. Wrapped from chest to ankles in layered silk. Head exposed. Face dried tight, eyes clouded. Not bones, not scattered remains. Preserved. Klein made a sound that wasn't a word. Reeve stepped closer, careful, as if the sink itself might be wired. The dead man's hands were wrapped around something in his lap. A telegraph sounder. Not the key, just the receiver torn loose. Reeves' chest tightened. He knew the story. Everyone in the interior knew it in fragments. A telegraph operator named Harlan sent out to service the line years ago, never seen again. Search parties blamed thirst, snakes, a fall. Out here you can blame anything. The country provides endless excuses. But Harlan hadn't vanished. He'd been kept. And around him, the silk lines radiated outward, thin strands running from the sink into multiple directions like spokes. This wasn't just a kill. It was a node. An amplifier point in the web. Klein stared at the sounder in Harlan's lap, then at Reeve. "That's why it was clicking." Reeve nodded once. Not triumph. Not relief. Only the grim satisfaction of a theory becoming real. The creature hadn't just found humans. It had found human tools. And it had incorporated them the way it incorporated fence posts and scrub roots, into a system of tension and signal. Reeve crouched and looked behind Harlan's shoulder at the rock face. Scratches. Not random. Deliberate marks cut into limestone with something hard. Klein leaned in. "What is that?" Reeve traced the lines with his eyes. A rough circle. Lines coming out like legs. A crude map of gullies branching. And one direction marked heavier than the others, as if the hand that carved it had pressed harder with urgency. A destination. Harlan had been trying to point. Not to the station. Not to the sink. To something deeper. Klein swallowed. He wanted someone to find it. The older man with the cough shook his head. He wanted them to stay away. Reeve stood slowly, looking from the scratches to the lines leaving the sink. Then he looked at the men, at their dust-black faces, at the silk flecks clinging to trousers, at the way their eyes kept flicking to the scrub like they expected it to move. "We can run," Reeve said. No one responded. The word run sounded childish out here. Reeve continued, voice low and steady. "We can run north until our feet break. Maybe we make a station, maybe we don't." He gestured at the silk lines. "But if we leave this, if we leave whatever he was pointing to, then it keeps doing this. not just to cattle. He nodded toward Harlan. To men. Klein's hands tightened on his rifle. You want to go toward it. Reeve didn't. Pretend it was noble. I want to burn it, he said. The words hung in the sink's cool air like smoke before flame. And if you're listening, you can feel the exact moment the story tightens. Because this is where survival becomes a choice. Not just escape. Consequence. Reeve looked at the powder sack. Then at the scratch map. Then back at the web lines running out of the sink like veins. Whatever it is, he said, it's not a single hunt. His voice dropped. It's a settlement. Outside the sink, somewhere in the scrub, a faint click sounded, dry, hard. Not the telegraph. Not metal. Something else. Something answering. The men froze. Reeve didn't move. He just listened, eyes fixed on the scrub line where the spokes vanished. And then he said, almost to himself, "It hurt us decide." He turned to the others. "We go now," he whispered, "before it tightens the country again." They climbed out of the sink, leaving Harlan where he'd been set like a warning sign no one wanted to read. They followed the direction carved into stone. And with every step, the strands became more frequent, more deliberate, as if the land ahead was not wilderness, but an entrance. The country changed the way it changes when you've made a decision you can't undo. Not dramatic, not sudden. Just a gradual tightening, scrub denser, gullies more frequent, the air cooler in pockets where the sun couldn't reach. Even the flies seemed to pull back, as if they knew better than to follow. They walked with the map scratched into stone, burned behind their eyes. Not a map in the clean sense. A desperate diagram made by a man with no paper and not enough time. Every so often Reeve stopped, crouched, and looked for the same sign. That faint sweet rot smell and the thin glitter of silk where light hit it right. And as the day wore on, those signs became less like clues and more like confirmation. They were on the correct path, which meant the creature had let them be on it. That thought sat in Klein's chest like a stone. Because if the web was a system, then a system didn't simply allow you to walk anywhere you wanted. A system rooted you. It guided you toward places where you could be handled. Places where the web was thick enough to do the work without a chase. Reeve didn't say it out loud, but you could hear it in how he gave orders now, quiet, precise. No sand if you can avoid it. Step on rock. Don't argue with a line, go around. When the men whispered, it wasn't to comfort each other. It was to keep their voices from becoming another signal. The horses moved stiffly, heads low, eyes wide. One still trembled from the yard incident, like its body hadn't decided the danger was over. Danger wasn't over. Danger had just become organized. They reached the gully mouth as the sun began to fall. Not the first gully where they'd found the herd. This one was narrower and deeper, its walls high enough to cut wind, shaded in places even in late afternoon. The temperature dropped 2 degrees as soon as they stepped into it. A cold breath rose from the stones, and with it came the smell, stronger than before. Sweet rot, damp dust, something faintly metallic like old pennies warmed in a hand. Klein stopped at the entrance, staring at the space between the walls. "If you were a man," he said, voice thin, "you'd pick this place to ambush." Reeve didn't look back. "That's why it's here." The older man with the cough, Prout, spat into the dirt and it landed with a dry tap. "We go in and it closes behind us." Reeve nodded once. He wasn't pretending otherwise. He pulled the lantern free, even though there was still light. The lantern wasn't for visibility. It was for certainty. It gave your eyes something to commit to when shadows started inventing shapes. He lit it. The flame caught and steadied. And they went in. 20 yards down, the first bundles appeared. At first, you didn't register them as bundles. You registered them as odd pale shapes on the gully wall, like sacks hung to dry. Then your mind put the shapes together, and you felt your throat tighten. Kangaroo-sized, dog-sized, some bigger. Wrapped tight, suspended from strands that ran up and disappeared into cracks in the stone. No blood, no open wounds. Just silk and a terrible stillness, as if the web didn't kill in a messy way. It stored. Klein raised his rifle instinctively, then lowered it again. There was nothing to shoot. Reeve kept them moving. He didn't let anyone stop under a hanging bundle. He didn't let anyone touch one, even out of pity or curiosity. Because the second rule of this place was emerging, clearer with every step. The web wasn't just around them. It was above them. And you don't stand beneath a ceiling you don't trust. The silk began as strands. Then it became lines. Then it became architecture. Thicker ropes ran along the ground like roots. Thin threads crossed the gully at chest height, positioned exactly where a man would stumble if he panicked. And everywhere the lantern beam swept, the silk caught it for an instant, white, shining, then gone again. If you're listening right now, imagine walking through that. Not seeing a big monster. Not even seeing a web you can avoid. Just feeling, constantly, that you're one careless movement away from touching something you won't be able to untouch. And you start to realize why a spider doesn't need to sprint. Speed is for predators that have to search. This one already knew where the traffic went. It only had to make the traffic pay. They reached a bend where the gully narrowed into a choke. The walls pressed closer. The floor dipped slightly. The air became damp enough to feel on skin. The lantern flame flickered. And then they saw the curtain. A thick drape of silk across the gully, spanning from wall to wall. Not webbing scattered in a corner. A deliberate barrier, layered, heavy, almost opaque. The kind of thing you could press your palm against and feel it press back. Klein swallowed. Is that the nest? Reeve stared at the curtain. We're not calling it that, he said. He didn't want a word that sounded small. Nests were for things you could stamp out. This felt like a facility. He stepped closer and held the lantern low, looking for the seam. The curtain wasn't flat. It had depth, multiple layers, strands within strands like a weave. He could see dust stuck in it, old leaves, tiny bones he refused to identify. The silk wasn't new. It had been here long enough to collect seasons. Reeve glanced at the powder sack on one of the horses. Then back at the curtain. He spoke quietly, like he was giving instructions to someone who might not survive to hear them again. We do this fast. Prute's cough scraped. Fast and quiet don't go together. Reeve's eyes stayed on the silk. Then we do it quiet, he said, and we accept it won't be fast. He reached into his coat and felt the telegraph key wrapped in cloth. Not because it was useful. Because it reminded him of the worst idea in his head, that the creature understood signals. And if it understood signals, then maybe you could lie to it. Maybe you could make it listen to the wrong thing. He lifted his knife, and instead of cutting the curtain, he cut a small corner, just enough to slip through. The silk resisted like rawhide. The blade moved slow, and the sound it made was not a slice but a low, sticky pull. Klein flinched at the noise. Reeve made the opening wider and pushed through. The silk clung to his shoulders and hat brim, trying to keep him. He forced his way in. And the world changed. Behind the curtain, the gully opened into a cavity. Not a simple cave. A chamber made larger by collapse, with a high ceiling that swallowed lantern light. The rock walls were no longer bare stone. They were coated, layered in silk. Not random, structured. Ribs of hardened thread ran up like supports. Arches formed where the silk had been laid and reinforced. In places it looked like plaster, in places like rope, in places like a woven mat. It had taken the shape of the cave and turned it into something else. Something with intention. Klein stepped in behind Reeve and stopped so hard he nearly dropped his rifle. His whisper was barely sound. "Jesus." Reeve didn't correct him. He didn't look away. Because in the center of the chamber was the reason the whole system existed. The egg mass. It wasn't the size of a fist. It wasn't even the size of a barrel. It was the size of a dray load. A swollen ovoid mound layered with silk and dust and hair and fragments of scrub, as if the creature had been packing it for months. The lantern light made it shine in dull patches. And when the flame flickered, the surface seemed to shift, not like a beating heart, but like something inside was pressing, adjusting, settling. Not one life. Many. Klein's breath hitched. Prout made a strangled sound and then forced it down, as if he was afraid even a cough might wake it. Reeve's brain did something odd. It started counting. How much powder, how much kerosene, how many matches, how far to the curtain, how fast a man could run in a gully full of silk. Because this was no longer about fear. It was about logistics. And logistics are a form of prayer when you're out of ideas. They weren't alone in the chamber. Reeve forced himself to look away from the egg mass and sweep the lantern around. The bundles on the walls were bigger here. Cattle-sized shapes wrapped and hung high. And among them, because the Outback never wastes a cruelty, were human outlines. At least 2. Maybe 3. He didn't move close enough to confirm. He didn't need to. Klein saw them too and went pale. Reeve felt something tighten behind his ribs that wasn't quite grief. It was the knowledge that every missing man's story out here was about to gain weight. If you were standing in that chamber, you'd feel it like this. You're not in a place where a creature lives. You're in a place where a creature processes. And suddenly, the telegraph sounder clicking back at the station made sense in the most sickening way. It wasn't haunting. It was proximity. This whole country was wired. And the wire led here. Reeve motioned them forward. Not toward the walls. Toward the egg mass. They moved as if in a church, careful, slow, stepping where the silk floor had hardened into a kind of mat. Each footfall made a faint adhesive sound, boot sole lifting from tacky thread. The horses couldn't fit through the curtain. They'd left them outside, tied and trembling. A sacrifice they hadn't spoken aloud. Reeve and Klein set the powder. They didn't pour it all in one pile. They split it into 3 smaller charges around the base of the mass, making a rough triangle. Redundancy again. If one failed, another might still do something. Prout held the lantern low while Reeve twisted cloth into a crude fuse, soaked it with the last of their kerosene. Their hands shook. Not because they were weak. Because the air in the chamber felt charged, like the whole place was elding tension. And that's when Klein did the worst possible thing a man can do when his brain is overloaded. He tried to find hope. He stepped toward one of the human bundles. He lifted the lantern, searching for a face, a sign of breath, anything. Reeve grabbed his shoulder hard and pulled him back. Klein's eyes were wild. There might be. Reeve cut him off. No. One word, absolute. Klein stared at him, hate and desperation mixing. Reeve didn't soften. Because the moment you start unwrapping the pantry, you become part of it. He leaned closer to Klein, voice low enough to feel like a secret shared with the dark. If we die in here, he said, it won't matter who was still breathing. Klein's jaw clenched. He nodded once and stepped back. They finished the fuse. Reeve checked the matches. 3 left. He tucked the rest away like they were coins. He looked at the curtain, then at the egg mass, then at the web ribs on the ceiling. He pictured fire running along all of it. And he understood the third rule. Fire doesn't just burn a web. It announces you to everything connected to it. Still, he struck the match. The flame blossomed small and bright, and for a moment it felt like they had introduced something alive and human into a place that didn't want it. Reeve touched the match to the cloth fuse. The cloth smoldered, then caught. A thin orange line crept toward the first powder pile. Klein backed up instinctively. Prout did too, lantern held close to his chest. And then the chamber answered them. Not with a roar. With a click. Dry hard. From the back of the chamber, where a darker passage opened like a throat. Click. Then another. Then a soft scraping, like heavy bristles dragged across silk. Reeve felt his blood go cold. The lantern beam swung toward the passage. A shape moved within it. Not the full Titan at first. A leg thick as a fence post, hooked into the silk floor and pulled. Then another. The creature emerged with a slow certainty that made panic feel childish. Low body, armored front, multiple eyes that didn't reflect the lantern the way an animal's eyes should. They absorbed light, making the gaze feel bottomless. Its mouthparts moved, tasting the air. And then it shifted its weight. Not toward Reeve. Toward the egg mass. Protective. Immediate. Like the egg mass wasn't just offspring, but the center of the entire operation. Klein raised his rifle. Reeve didn't stop him this time. Because the fuse was already burning. Because time had become a straight line. Klein fired. The shot cracked in the chamber and punched pain into every ear. The bullet struck the Titan's front plating and sparked, just a bright kiss of light, then vanished without slowing it. The Titan didn't roar. It lunged. A foreleg swept across the space with brutal speed, not stabbing but clearing. Klein was struck and thrown sideways into the silk-coated wall. The wall caught him, held him, and the sound that came out of Klein then wasn't a scream. It was a short, choking exhale as the silk grabbed his clothes and refused to let go. Reeve's body moved before thought. He grabbed Klein's coat and pulled. The silk stretched like fresh tar. It resisted, then gripped harder as if it sensed tension and tightened. Reeve pulled again, cloth tore. Klein's rifle clattered to the silk floor and stuck. Prout shouted something, just a raw sound, and swung the lantern up, as if light itself could hurt it. The fuse hissed. The first powder pile went off. A concussive thump that punched the air and slapped dust from the ceiling. The egg mass shuddered. Silk ripped open along one seam, collapsing inward, then bulging again. Reeve couldn't see what was inside clearly. He didn't want to. Pale shapes moved in the torn opening like a spill of writhing shadow. Not gore, not blood. Just life in the wrong quantity. The Titan reacted instantly. It turned fully toward the egg mass and slammed its body into it, shielding it with sheer bulk, legs anchoring into the silk floor like supports. Fire ran along the kerosene-soaked lines and climbed the ribs of the chamber. The silk didn't burn like cloth. It burned like oil, fast along tension threads, slow where it was thick, producing smoke that felt chemical in the throat. Reeve yanked Klein again. This time Klein came free in a staggering stumble, half wrapped in sticky strands that clung to his sleeves. Move, Reeve barked. They ran for the curtain. The Titan lashed a leg. Not aiming for them. Aiming for the root. The leg slammed down in front of the curtain, cracking the silk floor and shaking dust loose. Reeve's mind went blank for one clean second. Then from inside his coat, his fingers found the wrapped telegraph key. A stupid object, a relic. A piece of metal and wood. But it meant signal. He tore it free and threw it, hard, past the Titan's leg toward the curtain. It hit the silk wit. A sharp metallic clack. The sound was tiny compared to gunfire. And yet the Titan's head snapped toward it, immediate, precise. Not like an animal noticing movement. Like a sensor recognizing a pattern. Reeves saw the opening, one heartbeat of diverted attention. He grabbed Prute's arm, shoved Klein ahead, and dove low under the raised leg. The underside of the creature's body passed above him like a moving ceiling, hot and stinking of burnt silk and dust. He didn't look up. He didn't give his brain the picture. He just crawled, then stumbled, then ran. They burst through the curtain as fire began to collapse the chamber behind them, burning silk dropping in sheets. Outside the curtain, the gully was suddenly bright, late daylight stabbing in, smoke curling out like a signal. The horses screamed. Not one. All. The sound was chaos. Reeve grabbed the nearest rope and yanked. The horse resisted, then surged forward in blind panic. Klein stumbled after, coughing smoke. Prute's cough turned into a wet, choking fit, but he kept moving. Behind them, the Titan forced itself toward the curtain. Not fully aflame, but smoking, strands burning out on its body like embers. It didn't retreat. It didn't hesitate. It came after them into its own corridor. Because now the web wasn't a trap. It was a battlefield. And the creature had decided the intruders were worth the cost. They ran down the gully. Not because it was the best route. Because it was the only route that wasn't instantly blocked by silk lines they couldn't see. The horses dragged them, half pulling, half stumbling, hooves striking stone. Smoke followed, thick and bitter. And under it all, beneath the panic, was a tremor through the gully walls, like the whole system was tightening. The Titan's legs struck the silk behind them, and each impact sent vibrations through the lines. Reeve didn't need to see it to know it was close. He could hear it in the way strands snapped and recoiled. In the way stones clicked as something heavy negotiated the narrow path. Then, as they rounded a bend, the gully widened and the floor turned to sand. Red fine deep. The horses sank slightly and slowed. Reeve's stomach dropped. Sand meant vibration. Sand meant easy anchoring. Sand meant you were back on the creature's chosen material. Klein yelled, wordless, pointing ahead. A line. Not one strand. A thick band of silk stretched across the gully at chest height, barely visible until the lantern light caught it. If the horse hit it at speed, it would be cut or tangled or thrown. Reeve yanked the rope and forced the horse sideways, scraping along the gully wall. The band brushed the horse's shoulder and tightened, but not enough to take it. Klein ducked under. Prute followed, wheezing, nearly caught. Reeve felt the band graze his hat brim as he passed, and the silk stuck for a split second before peeling away. And he felt that vibration again. A pulse traveling down the line, away, broadcasting. They're here, they're moving, they're alive. The Titan's response came as a deep, pulsing thrum that you felt more than heard. Not rage. Not pain. A recalculation. Reeve's mind flashed to the anchor shard they dug up at the station. The glossy black hook buried like a peg. This wasn't just web. It was rigging. And rigging could be adjusted. He shouted out of the gully. Klein looked at him like he was insane. Reeve pointed up the wall, where rock broke into a climbable slope. Now! They scrambled. Hands and knees, slipping in dust, grabbing scrub roots. The horses couldn't climb, not in that panic. Reeve made himself do the cruel arithmetic. He cut the lead rope. The horse bolted, wild, down the gully. A decoy. A sacrifice. Klein stared horrified. Reeve didn't apologize. He couldn't afford the time it took to be human about it. They hauled themselves onto the rim and collapsed into scrub, lungs tearing, eyes streaming. Below, the gully continued. The decoy horse's hooves thundered away. For 3 seconds, it sounded like escape. Then the sound cut off sharply, as if the horse had run into something soft and final. Not a scream. A sudden silence. Reeve swallowed, because that meant the gully had closed. Not with rock. With silk. And silk doesn't need a gate. It only needs a line in the right place. They moved on foot again, staggering across scrub flats in the last light. Smoke from the burning chamber rose behind them like a black finger. If there were station people within 10 miles, they'd see it. If there were riders, they'd come. And if the Titan, or anything connected to it, read smoke the way it read vibration, then the fire had done more than burn a nursery. It had announced war. Klein's sleeve was still tacky with silk. He tried to peel it off, but it stretched and snapped back, leaving threads clinging like hair. Prute's breathing was bad. Every inhale whistled slightly. Reeve. He kept them moving anyway, pushing toward a pale patch he could see ahead. A salt pan. Flat open, no scrub to anchor lines. It looked like safety purely because it looked empty. They stepped onto it as the sun dipped. The crust crunched under boots like thin ice. Klein exhaled something close to relief. No lines, he said. Reeve didn't answer. He watched the ground. The crust was cracked in a pattern too regular. Not a natural polygon. A series of long stress lines, like something had been tugging beneath. Reeve crouched and brushed dust away with his fingers. A faint thread caught on his nail. Silk. Not laid on top. Embedded in the crust. His stomach sank. Back, he said. Klein blinked. What? Back now. Prute took one step back. The crust beneath him gave a tiny shiver, like skin reacting to touch. Then a crack shot across the pan at ankle height, racing fast. The ground sagged in a shallow dip. And from beneath the crust, a thick sheet of silk rose as if pulled up by invisible hands. It caught Prute's boot and cinched. Prute fell hard, coughing, hands clawing at the crust. Klein lunged to grab him. Reeve grabbed Klein's belt and yanked him back. Klein screamed, "Let go." Reeve snarled, "Look." The silk didn't just hold Prute. It began to wrap. Fast, smooth, like a net drawn tight. Prute's arms pinned. His coughing turned into muffled choking sounds as the silk climbed his chest. No gore. No tearing. Just the absolute horror of being packaged. Reeve's grip on Klein tightened until it hurt. Klein struggled, eyes wild, trying to pull free. Reeve didn't let him. Because beneath the crust, the pan shivered again. More silk shifted. More lines tightened. This wasn't a single trap. It was a field of them. A minefield made of thread. If you were here, this is the moment you'd understand the true scale of the system. The Titan didn't need to be beside you to take you. The web could do it. Reeve forced himself to do the unthinkable. He let Prute go. Not because he was heartless. Because one man trapped could become 2, then 3, then none. Prute's eyes locked onto Reeve's for 1 second, pure pleading, pure disbelief. Reeve mouthed something that wasn't a word. Then he dragged Klein off the salt pan, boots slipping, crust cracking behind them. They hit scrub again and kept running until their lungs burned. Behind them, the salt pan settled. The cracks quieted. The surface became still. And the only sign something had happened was a single dark shard protruding from the crust near where Prute fell. A glossy black anchor. A peg. like the one at the telegraph station. The web had been staked into the earth beneath the pan. It hadn't been laid across the land. It had been installed. Klein stumbled, turned, and made a sound like he was going to go back. Reeves slapped him hard across the face. Not to punish. To reset him. Klein stared at Reeve, shock and hatred and grief. Reeves' voice came out low, vicious with necessity. If you go back, he said, you'll just disappear faster. Klein trembled. Then slowly he nodded. And they kept moving. 2 men now. 1 lantern. No horses. No powder. No proof except the telegraph key Reeve had thrown into the curtain of silk, gone forever. The Outback took the evidence as easily as it took men. They reached a station fence line at dawn. Not their station. A northern run. A real one with posts, wire, and a dog barking at the sound of movement. Klein collapsed against the fence and slid down like his bones had been removed. Reeve stayed standing, hands on knees, breathing through pain in his ribs. A stockman came running with a rifle, then slowed as he saw their faces. The dog kept barking, but the bark had a nervous edge, like even the animal didn't trust what it was smelling. "Where'd you come from?" the stockman demanded. Reeve tried to speak and found his throat had closed. He swallowed and forced the words out. "Southwest," he said. "Don't go southwest." The stockman frowned. "What happened?" Klein started laughing, one short broken burst, then covered his mouth with both hands as if to stop it. Reeve looked at the man and tried to choose language that wouldn't get them dismissed. He failed. "It's a web," he said. The stockman stared. Reeve continued anyway, because once you start, you either finish or you choke. "It's not just a creature, it's the country. It's rigged. Anchors in the ground, lines in gullies under salt." The stockman's face tightened. "You been drinking?" Reeve shook his head slowly. Then he said the only detail that sounded concrete enough to survive disbelief. "The telegraph sounder was clicking," he said, "with no man in the room." That made the stockman hesitate, not because it proved a spider, but because it was specific. And specific things are harder to laugh off. They brought them in under the veranda. Water first, shade. Blanket thrown over Klein's shoulders like you could wrap the horror back down into a manageable shape. A station owner arrived, older, suspicious, the kind of man who'd seen lies and heat stroke and knew the difference. He listened without interrupting while Reeve spoke. Reeve didn't embellish. He didn't need to. The Outback gives you plenty without invention. He described the cocooned herd. The anchor hook. The horse being dragged. Harlan preserved in silk, holding a sounder like a relic. The scratched map. The egg mass like a cartload. The fire. The salt pan. When Reeve finished, the station owner didn't call him mad. He didn't laugh. He just stared out at the distance, as if the horizon had changed shape. Finally he asked, "How big?" Reeve looked at the yard where a bull stood flicking flies. He raised his hand higher than the bull's shoulder. "Higher than that," he said. The owner nodded slowly, like a man accepting a debt. Then he said something that sounded like sense, and yet carried the weight of surrender. "We'll send riders," he said. "We'll see." Reeve didn't argue, because he knew what they'd see. If the creature wanted to be found, it would be found. If it didn't, they would ride into emptiness and come back angry, and the story would become another Outback lie told to fill evenings. Klein stared at the floorboards, lips moving without sound. Reeve watched the walls of the house, listening. Not for footsteps. For clicking. Because once you've heard a sounder talk by itself, every quiet room becomes suspicious. Later accounts, dry notes in station records, brief mentions in correspondence, suggest a party did ride southwest. They found the gully. They found smoke-stained rock where silk had burned. They found strands in the scrub that stuck to boots and refused to brush off. They did not find an animal waiting to be shot. Because the Outback has always done this, it refuses to provide the tidy proof men demand. And yet cattle losses increased in the months that followed, on runs that had never had trouble before. Herds found bunched tight, refusing certain waterholes. Dogs that wouldn't go into certain gullies. A rider's hat found in scrub with no rider near it. And along the old telegraph routes, where the line once made the country feel smaller, men started reporting something else. Not sightings. Sounds. A faint clicking in abandoned rooms. A wire that hummed on a still day. A fence post that creaked as if something unseen had tightened a line. Reeve never went back. He stayed on stations that kept to open ground, avoided gullies, avoided salt pans, avoided any place where the land could be rigged without being seen. Men called him cautious. Then they called him coward. He let them, because cowardice is just a name people use when they haven't touched the line yet. If you're listening to this on headphones and you've stayed this far, you've probably noticed what the story has done to you. It's made you suspicious of silence. It's made you imagine tension where you can't see it. That's the real contagion of the Outback. Not fear of one creature. Fear of a system you can't unlearn. And the final note attached to Reeve's statement, written years later in careful handwriting, doesn't offer closure. It doesn't claim victory. It doesn't claim the country was made safe. It simply advises, avoid travel southwest of the line. Until further notice. No reason given. As if the land had been quietly reassigned. As if something out there had filed its claim in silk and anchor hooks and humming lines. And perhaps the worst part is this. If the creature was intelligent enough to test a telegraph sounder, to listen, to learn, to mimic, then it wasn't confined to one gully. It wasn't even confined to one era. Because you don't need to understand words to understand what words do. They coordinate. They bring men together. They bring herds down the same routes. They create patterns. And patterns are what a spider lives on. So if you take a warning from this, don't take the simple one. Don't take beware the gully. Take the deeper one. In empty country, when you feel that sudden, irrational hesitation, like the air itself is telling you not to step forward. Listen, because sometimes the Outback isn't empty. Sometimes it's just waiting for you to touch the line.